Hi, this is Paul. I want to continue working on my vein of religion and culture. The videos that I made last week, the videos that touched on kinfolk and Ross Douthat's The Decadent Society, those things really got me thinking about the idea that your religious ceiling is your cultural ceiling. You won't have a cultural revival, escape from Douthat's decadence, without a religious revival. This is a very counter secularism narrative, and I'm going to play some Eric Weinstein in this. Eric, I think, has well, anyway, we'll get to Eric when we get to Eric. But it's a very counter secularist narrative, which is almost always looking for a technical solution. And I think that in many ways that's barking up the wrong tree, which is sort of where Daniel Schmachtenberger lies. I've been trying to get through Eric Weinstein's Portal, where he, thanks Ken, Eric Weinstein's Portal, where he talks to Daniel Schmachtenberger. I first discovered Schmachtenberger on Rebel Wisdom, and I really liked a lot of the episodes that he's been in. And his conversation with Eric, I thought, was really very good. There's so much stuff in that conversation, and I think it very much barks up this tree about the relationship between religion and culture and a future. One of the things that often strikes me when I listen to some of these celebrity atheists talk about Christianity is their boredom with the age to come, and it basically goes like this: I can't imagine living forever. That would be a real problem because I get bored in this world and I'll get bored in that world. Celebrity atheists regularly declare that for them, even if this fictitious everlasting afterlife were to be true in an experiential, phenomenological way, it would be torture because they can't imagine what they would do everlastingly. Now, this isn't just the celebrity atheists. If you watch The Good Place, I don't want to give too much away, but they basically cave to the same thing. That you can't imagine everlastingly being everlastingly good. Now, the best theologian in the Christian Reformed Church, I believe, is Cornelius Plantinga Jr., and he is the younger brother of Alvin Plantinga. And Neil Plantinga was my systematics professor at Calvin Seminary. He was my faculty advisor for a couple of years. Um, he he was president of Calvin Seminary. I don't think that used the best areas of his gifts. Last little thing I heard from him, he was going to take some time and write some books, which I think is exactly what he needs to be doing. I wish he would put more out. If you want a taste of his ability, read Not the Way It's Supposed to Be, A Breviary of Sin, which is really an outstanding book. And not only is Neil a brilliant thinker, but he's a absolutely amazing writer. And so the number of theologians in the Christian Reformed Church. Now, again, people sometimes call me a theologian. I'm not a theologian, I'm a pastor. And you'll often hear Tim Keller make the same comment. The reason being is that I'm not fundamentally an academic. Sure, I read some academic stuff, but that's not really my life or my training. I'm a pastor, and I'm a pastor who has to dabble in theology, but we also dabble in all sorts of other things. That's sort of what being a pastor does. But Neil, in an interview, said something to the effect that he wants to, maybe it wasn't an interview, maybe it was a personal conversation, I don't know, but he wanted to spend some time essentially thinking about the afterlife. And I remember when he said that, or when I heard that, I thought, wow, that's really good and actually really important, because the further I've gotten into this YouTube video talking out loud thing, the more I've realized this is a real issue in theology today, that this ceiling that we're experiencing culturally, I think, has been around theologically for a while, and I probably Douthat really sort of helped me see that. And again, Douthat's book is a really interesting book because to a certain degree he makes the point that, you're going to have to listen to Miss Frizzle, and if you're going to make progress, things are going to have to get messy. You're going to have to take chances. And that's a really scary thing. But if you look back over the course of church history, this is a point I've made sort of on the heels of Alistair McGrath's book Heresy, which Sam says isn't really in the book, but I'm sort of extending. Well, so sort of like the person at the end of the service says, "Pastor, that sermon really spoke to me," and then they'd say what it spoke to them, and I realize I never said it. Maybe McGrath didn't say it, but theology and heresy sort of co-develop, and so it is a messy process. And so Neil wants to take some time to think about death and say, I don't want to use heaven, I want to use the age to come, because technically that's a better way of thinking about it. Heaven is geography in a sense, and the age to come is there's a new heavens and a new earth that are seen at the end of the book of Revelation. And so I think I really want Neil to make some progress here, because I think this is really something that we need. But the thought occurred to me, strictly a hypothetical story, not really. A stray cat is rescued by an idealistic young woman. An overly indulgent father refuses to put his foot down to exile the cat into the neighborhood or the pound, or as my father would sometimes joke about, into a sack with stones and a bridge looking over the Sacramento or American rivers. He didn't have those rivers, he had the Passaic River to joke about. The cat might have eked out a short life in an urban setting, but it now gets to realize what a human bed is like and what a bowl full of food is like. And this is certainly an upgrade from living in the wild. You get that if you read the beginning of, what's the name of that book? Can't think of it now. But the author made the observation that lions in the zoo, we look at those lions in the zoo and say, oh, they should be out on the Serengeti. Well, zoo lions live longer. They've got free food and health care. And, there's something that we notice that is not optimized about the zoo experience for a lion. But the author of that book, why can't I think of the book? Big Tiger on the very famous book. Martel is the author. He makes a really important point in that book that if someone were to say, zoologically float down over humanity and look at human beings and say, oh, look at them, they're all in these little boxes and they've all got this food and health care and stuff. We should yank them out there and throw them out on the Serengeti. They'll be much happier when they're wild. Human beings don't go there. So here's the thing. This cat could never have imagined what living in a human house is like and what having all the silly cat needs are like. And the cat is not a terribly grateful animal, by the way. My dog, for being a jerk, because my dog is a jerk, the cat is just much more indifferent. And for all of the comforts and welfare that this idealistic young woman, also known as my daughter, has given to this cat, the cat is indifferent in some ways, but very much wants into the house and very much wants onto the bed and very much wants to be fed and on and on and on and on. But the cat could never have imagined what a human bed feels like. Why? Because the cat is not capable of imagining such a thing on its own. It's only when a greater consciousness, a greater power, a greater mind, a greater agent, a greater master, a greater host comes in and provides something for the cat that the cat could never in its wildest dreams imagined, nor could the whole community of cats come up with. And for that matter, well, we still have questions about what is good, and in many ways that haunts a lot of the conversations that we're going to point to. So, it wasn't until really I found the Douthat book that I really began to understand Eric Weinstein and Peter Thiel a lot better, because I'd heard them make noises about this one way or another, especially common use of the word sclerosis in this context. That Douthat really helped me better understand sort of what Eric Weinstein's banging on about. Eric's an interesting cat. There's no question about. An interesting critter. There's no question about that. But again, Douthat helped contextualize that for me. Now, again, I do believe that having let's call it a modestly sized YouTube channel is about the best source for good information, pre-filtered stuff, because the kind of tips that you all give me, and again, I never have enough time to track down all the tips, but the kind of tips you guys give me are some of the best stuff that I find, and so then I should share it back to you. And so the recent portal with Eric Weinstein and Daniel Schmachtenberger, I'm sure Job could have a better way to say that, or some of you Germans who are out there in the Discord land, and then Ross Douthat on the Fifth Column, which is a podcast I'd never heard of, but the hosts were really engaging. I'll probably listen to some more of them. Very interesting stuff. And again, so I want to play some of both of this, because it gets into this question, again, of the religious ceiling and the cultural ceiling, that in a sense you need religious headroom if your culture is actually going to make progress. And now again, this idea of progress is itself enormously difficult to actually conceptualize, and that difficulty relativizes all of these conversations, and it especially relativizes the Weinstein brothers in ways that I don't think they're terribly self-conscious of, because again, almost every time I listen to them, either of them, I get the sense that just good is just so completely assumed well within the Christendom frame that they are not terribly self-conscious of it. One of the things that comes through all of this stuff this came through with the Alistair McGrath, Brett Weinstein conversation, comes through with John Vervaeke's project and a lot of his conversations, this aching for a new religion that isn't a religion. And somehow we know we need that, even though, again, secularism is perhaps basically the demand that there be no appeal to self-conscious agents above human beings. That's basically it. No theism, no aliens. We've got to keep. We hold the bar here, and so all of our hope must be found there. And I know Carl. Yeah, Carl and I are. Carl. That's why the iron box of secularism, because you can't think above it, because it's not allowed. That's essentially the secular bargain, to say, keep it in here, thank you very much. So you're religious people, yeah, we know you're out there, and we really shouldn't persecute you, but we're not really going to take too many of you seriously, because this is the playing field, and everything needs to stay in these bounds. But this keep bumping into needing a new religion is giving away the game. So in this conversation, they get to the point of wanting to know, is decadence so bad after all? I didn't set up. Hang on. So this stuff isn't on YouTube, so I'll play it out of my podcast app.
I think essential to the argument that Ross is making, though, is in understanding that a lot of the economic gains that we've seen and the productivity improvements that we've seen have happened in particular places where the gains have been really concentrated in a few hands, with these technology companies, Facebook being like the new GM, but only employing a tenth of the people that a GM might have employed. So that is part of the problem. But then secondarily,
so that's essentially the argument of the first half of Douthat's book.
The nature of the innovation that we're seeing. In some cases, it's again like some sort of technology, information-oriented benefit that is, again, concentrated to a particular group, but also the possibility that some of the gains we've seen, as you just mentioned, Ross, are fake. Like the growth of a company like Uber, for example, it's not clear that this is a sustainable business model. In fact, all of the indications are that it might not be. Like in the same thing that we've seen with WeWork, they're running these massive deficits as they have been for a very long time. They're doing it with rather cheap money on offer from VCs. I've seen the phrase free money used at certain points. So that all of that creates a circumstance that's rather challenging. But I want to see if we can advance the conversation a little bit, because we've talked about sort of the four horsemen, the stagnation and the sterility and the sclerosis and the repetition.
What's that accent?
Yeah,
Oh, is that an accent?
Yeah, it was an accent.
That's just Camille. I
don't know.
There was a bit of a growl.
There's a
Yeah.
growl.
I thought it was. I thought it was.
That was kind of that was like your decadent
powerful
accent.
I don't know what that is. It's a little Rick Ross.
For the audio.
Well, we talked about those four things. I wonder if we can get into sort of the second section of the book where you talk about sustainable decadence, among other things. But that section of the book is probably the only place where I got a little bit queasy when you talked about giving decadence its due. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what you saw there, and if it's helpful, I could prime you by telling you what about it made me feel.
Tell me what made you queasy.
Well, I'll tell you. I think you opened the chapter by talking about people who are probably following along with you and thinking to themselves, well, you know what, this decadence thing doesn't sound like such a bad thing.
Yep.
And this is, again, right here, now we're getting into the question, what is good? And so the value question. So decadence, well, a stable economy. And what's so interesting about this is that, especially, let's say if you go back to Alistair McGrath, Brett Weinstein conversation, sustainability is the big thing, you know, and that haunts Eric's. And when I jump into Eric's podcast, sustainability is haunting these conversations, because how do we, and again, the assumption is, well, we, Homo sapiens, well, we, not certain kinds of Homo sapiens, the Homo sapiens that think like us. And you get back to if you haven't listened to my conversation where we talked about religion as risk management, this idea that what we're really trying to do, it's a very evolutionary idea. The idea that what we're trying to do, is essentially secure the future for our progeny. But that, of course, assumes that you can, now we'll bring in the fancy Vervaeke ideas, you can exactly figure out what the essence of we is. And that's what makes let's say, the humans evolving into the Borg or some kind of technologically merged creature, more than just having a cell phone in hand, that this somehow breaks the narrative or breaks the line. And so humanity is cut off in the sense like the Neanderthals. And so that leads to the question, well, maybe we've arrived. Well, you know, it's kind of interesting. In 1999, they talk about 1999 in this podcast as sort of a little break in decadence. Well, that was the year The Matrix came out, and that's the year that Agent Smith tells Morpheus, you know, humanity reached its peak in 1999. Are we just trying to freeze 1999, and that then is the apex of human civilization? What is it?
In some respects, like, we've had too much growth and we're endangering our planet, and there is the climate catastrophe. And if, in fact, we've actually had all of these good things happen over the course of the last couple hundred years, and we've reached this place where, you know, we've got relatively low rates of crime, there's a pretty good amount of wealth out there, we've got cars and all kinds of other cool stuff in medical technology, stasis is an option.
Yep.
That we can manage our decadence, that we can manage this level of stagnation and make certain that we find ways to perhaps redistribute the gains and just protect what we have here.
And I think, here's the thing. That would require a societal religious conversion, probably away from Christianity. You know, if you go back to the Delling-Pod conversation with Tom Holland makes the point numerous times that progress is invented by Christianity and infused into the world by Christianity. And of course, it goes lots of non-Christian places, but that's where it comes from. And so this stasis that, well, maybe we can't afford progress anymore. We want stasis. But Eric Weinstein and Brett Weinstein and Ross Douthat, Roman, conservative, committed, practicing Roman Catholic that he is, say no, it's upward and outward, and that's Christianity. That's it's we're on the way to theosis or heaven or the age to come. We're marching towards glory, baby. And no, we've got to stop marching and we've got to stay right here. Well, would we bump into the meaning crisis? Would we bump into Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and saying, if you give human beings everything they want, again, I use back to the illustration of the alligator and the alligator farm in the Everglades. That alligator sits in that warm water all the time, just waiting for the zookeeper to throw bits of chicken in there for them to gobble it up, and that alligator will be just fine. The lion will be just fine in the pen. We are different. And actually, again, in the Schmachtenberger Weinstein conversation, they actually go there with that conversation, and they talk about, well, human beings are different from the lion, different from the chimp, different from the alligator in the farm. Why can't we just level it out at 1999 and be happy, as human batteries making energy for our future cyber overlords?
But that sort of impulse to protect what we have, I presume is what animates the fears of populists, that things aren't really getting better anymore.
Yep.
And in some respects, they're starting to get worse.
And not just the fears of populists, because here's the problem. If we're going to do stasis how? Your dreams of you, whether it's the old school, climbing to the top, your turn at the trough, finally your world where racism and sexism and all the isms are gone. Imagine that world. And guess what? Grandma got stuck. And this is where we as individuals and we as this imagined collective, which again, Gray says, well, that's totally Christian, where that whole thing comes from. Oh, how is this supposed to work? And if we can't stay the same because I've not reached nirvana.
And to the extent we find ourselves in a place like that, I just can't imagine any circumstance under which a citizenry would actually be content with that they could ever learn to be content with that they could elect leaders with the specific mandate of, hey, just try to keep everything from falling apart.
Now remember Jordan Peterson as well, and the city on the hill, because meaning, again, is this internal gyroscope. Meaning is we partake in the sacrament of meaning when we're striving towards the goal. What happens when you say, no more striving, no more striving? It's sort of maybe if Buddhism had won the West, that's what we've had. I don't know if that's unfair. I'm sure you'll correct me in the comments section. But no more striving, just flatten it out. Thank you very much. It's the, what was it? Mad TV had lowered expectations.
Keep the wheels on the bus a little bit longer. I think you really only have two options because of entropy, like political, philosophical entropy. You either are growing or you are declining. Like stasis is in fact a form of decline. And I know that when you were writing that section, you were speaking to people's concern rather than expressing your own sensibilities. But certainly as I was reading that, I was like already leaping towards the next section of the book.
Yeah. Well, that's but I think a lot of people wouldn't, right? Which is why I wrote it. I mean, sure. I think there's, there is a strong conception in the Western world that, growth has become cancerous, and that climate change requires maybe not budgetary austerity, but sort of austerity in everyday living. There's a book that came out by a German economist after I finished writing my book called Fully Grown, that basically made a version of this case. It said, economies, it's in a way a version of the George Will argument that you were channeling, but basically saying 1.5% growth for an advanced economy is fine, and we shouldn't, and we should just want other countries to advance as far as we have, and then we can all be fully grown together.
Nassim Taleb in his book, but doesn't like George Will.
I basically have two views. One is that sort of politics of stasis is better than a sort of destructive, let's tear it all down, Tyler Durden in Fight Club, another 1999 movie, right? They're like it's better stasis than some of this sort of
at least for those who have something to lose, for those who have nothing left to lose, which again is why the West has been amazingly good. And again, they talked about porn and drugs a little bit in this podcast, but another great section in the Portal podcast, which I won't play too, you just get everybody pot and porn, and that's why you have no civil wars, because after all, might not be as good as I can, and I might not ever actually be able to have sex with all those beautiful women on the flickering screen. Well, at least I've got my basement and my Cheetos dust to comfort me.
Evolutionary alternatives, because like Michael was saying, the politics of anti-decadence can be very dangerous, right? You get, not just the Nazis, but World War I, you get some of the mood after 9/11, which was very much like decadence is over now and we're going to go, spread democracy to the Islamic world. So I wanted to make that point. But then at the same time, I basically agree with you. I think you can have stasis longer than people think, but it's a stasis that will include a certain amount of decay and a certain sort of what I think I call something like the slide towards dystopia. So it's not that you're like, you give up on growth and the next day it's Aldous Huxley or, Brave New World, but you sort of slide in that direction. And I think the technologies we have right now, I think encourage that in certain ways, that you can have a world where, people sort of work out their discontents with decadence by playing video games or, by sort of participating in vigorous activity that is, not actually located in the real world, or in politics, that people can be discontented with decadence and manifest that in how they behave on social media rather than in like political organizing or anything that might meaningfully change the world. And so,
it's a shocking thing that for all our talk of political polarization and gridlock, once the pandemic hit, bang, $2 trillion came out of that wallet pretty darn fast.
When I imagine that kind of stasis, that's what I imagine happening. People sort of engaging more and more in sort of...
Did I say wallet? I mean credit card.
Virtual role-playing, actual politics and sort of social life withering a bit, and things sort of sliding towards a dark place, but pretty slowly, so slowly that maybe you don't notice it till you end up there.
Which one of these things? I mean, reading this book, it was interesting for me to try to read your level of worry on each one of these topics. I mean, of course, you have government, technology, talk about pornography, fertility rates. Is there one area in which you're fretting more than the other areas? We say, this one is something that I don't see being rolled back anytime soon, and it's going to, precipitate this slide to horrible decadence.
I mean, I think it's probably clear from reading the book that I'm most worried about this sort of Brave New World scenario where things stabilize in a way that sort of slowly dehumanizing us, and that drugs become more sophisticated, video games become more sophisticated, and we sort of accept this sort of decaying stability that loses basic human goods. People don't marry and have kids. They sort of lose themselves in, I compare it to the land of the lotus eaters, right, in Odysseus. And I don't think we're anywhere close to the darkest place yet, but I think that's been the trend of the last 25 or 30 years, right, towards this, like in teenage life right now. Teenage life in the U.S. is safer than it's ever been in terms of whether you're going to drive drunk or have sex or get pregnant, all these things. And these are all things conservatives were obviously very concerned about 30 years ago. So in a way, you could say, well, this is what conservatives wanted. But those same kids are not sort of Well, one, they're more depressed and more anxious, seemingly, I think pretty clearly than even when I was in college.
Now, what's really interesting about Douthat's book is he has nothing good to say about Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson gets like 2 or 3 mentions in the book, but what he's talking about here is exactly what the Jordan Peterson moment was around. And so now Douthat, from his peaks of status that have him living in New Haven, Connecticut, and working for the New York Times, I don't think he understands Jordan Peterson the way he should, but this very much is where decadence meets the meaning crisis. It's right there.
They're more likely to commit suicide. And then they're, for now at least, less likely to fall in love, get married, and have kids, and sort of enter what a conservative would think of as sort of a normal trajectory towards human flourishing. And so there's been this sort of trade-off of sort of more social stability than 30, 40 years ago, but maybe less happiness and less flourishing. So that's what I worry about the most. Again, like in terms of our ability to respond to threats, though, I think it's the sclerosis of institutions that's the most dangerous. So if you're worried about, again, the coronavirus or anything that could lead to mass extinction, true disaster, you should worry most about the inability of our institutions to function anymore.
Is this a Catholic book?
Sure. All my books are Catholic books.
Are they all Catholic books?
It's a great podcast. You should listen to it. I listen to like one-offs of a lot of different podcasts, but after listening to this one, I thought I might listen to some more of these guys. But I thought Douthat made the point here's decadence, and again, this is what I've heard Eric and Peter Thiel talk about. But now suddenly, here in this with Daniel Schmachtenberger, Eric starts going down a different take, and Eric is over time laying more and more of his cards on the table. Maybe I just haven't listened to everything that Eric is doing, although he's putting out a lot now. Okay, this is a long one, and I found so much stuff that have provoked insight in me in this podcast. I'm really tempted to sort of outline it. And if any of you know whether he's doing transcripts or anything like that out of this, let me know. His getting this stuff up on YouTube is always a long time after. Maybe not everybody works as cheap and dirty as me, but he actually has real commercials on his podcast. But this is they both sort of they get do some things, and by about 22 minutes they start to get into stuff.
All right, so let me give a little bit of my frame. We can try to pass things back and forth, and feel free to take over if you like. But here's what I see that I think of as being really interesting and rather mysterious. I see a decision tree in which I think at a society-wide level, I can't accept any of the major branches. So one branch would be that we have a self-extinguishing human event, let's say an all-out nuclear war where people miscalculate and the planet is unrecognizable. Then there's a different branch that says that there's some sort of a environmental collapse, maybe with a nuclear exchange or some sort of synthetic biology, who knows what, where there are survivors, but it's not the world that we see out our window here. Then there's another one which says maybe we managed to trundle on for another 1,000 years, somehow limping along without any major new ideas. We're still using markets.
There's the decadent option.
Things are getting incrementally better. Maybe there are some big breakthroughs here and there, but there's no big breakthrough in human wisdom. So that we have the same.
Love that wisdom came in there.
Same dangerous objects, but we continue to be lucky that nobody weaponizes these things and that there's no broad collapse. Then there's an escape branch where we end up on Mars, or maybe we escape even farther out in the universe, or maybe we get uploaded into silicon. There's no part of this tree.
See, now right there, we get uploaded into silicon, we go out to space. Who is we? Now again, back to the risk management idea of religion. Religion is about securing your legacy, your progeny, your line. Now, terribly fuzzy on what this line is, and even what necessarily well-being is, especially when you look at the decadent option, because essentially what what Douthat does is just sort of lay the decadence and the meaning crisis, just lays them together, even though Douthat, I don't know if he's heard of John Vervaeke, and he doesn't seem to have much appreciation for Jordan Peterson, but you're laying it right there. It's the same point. And again, the main question here is our religious ceiling our cultural ceiling? And in order to get beyond it, and I got to be careful here, because I got plenty of New Age friends that would say to me, well, of course, Paul, we need a new consciousness. And I just kind of roll my eyes and say, well, what do you mean by that? We need a new consciousness. You can't even explain to me the consciousness that I know. And I've lived in it all my life, or at least since the age of 4 or whatever. What? And this, again, is where, this again is where I appreciate, the conversations that we're having in our little corner of the internet, because we need to talk about this. And when I look at political solutions are technical. And remember, politics is now and religion is always. So if you're actually going to move politics, you have to move the vision of always. And you have to move the vision of good. And this is why, these guys keep talking, and it's religion. No, but I'm not going to talk to religious people. And fair enough. Because, and I really appreciate Douthat's honesty. In the other podcast, a little bit later, he talks about the decadence of the Roman Catholic Church. It was the decadence of the Catholic Church that prompted the Protestant Reformation. There's plenty of decadence in the Protestants now. We've been around for hundreds of years. There's plenty of decadence in theology. There's plenty of things that have just sort of withered. And now in this strange pandemic church realm, I get to kind of peek in at what other pastors are doing with their sermons and overhear stuff, and I think, nobody's doing anything new. The church was in decadence long before these guys, so I don't blame them for not wanting to listen to anybody from a church. I don't blame them for that. I can understand it, but I think that's part of your dead end too. And this goes back again to Richard Marsden's book on the twilight of the American Enlightenment. And I forget what other I was reading on that. If you look at, what was Douthat's book? If you look at the 50s and the 60s, you still had conversation including religious people. Now, I don't want to cast blame here and say that they stopped looking to the tree because it wasn't bearing fruit, or they couldn't see the fruit because they weren't looking at it. But there's something here. And now, this is really dangerous stuff for conservative religious people, because part of religious conservatism is trying to not lose what you've achieved. But so much of the religious left is so fruitless anyway, because it's just so pornographic. It's so self-indulgent. And it's so Me Too-ish in terms of, well, whatever the new hot social thing is, what color flag do I need to fly next? Will you love me now? And I think about Akira the Don's comment in one video where, how much more naked can Madonna get? There's a sense in multiple aspects that we've painted ourselves into a corner, and a technical solution is not what we need.
It looks sensible to me. Every single branch is somewhere in sci-fi. Are you seeing something that looks like that, or do you have some branches that you think are more probable and more hopeful?
More hopeful, yes. Probable, no. But I can't do a probability calculation because they're unprecedented, so I don't have priors.
Well, you have to impute.
Yeah. So the first two that you said, existential risk and catastrophic risk, there's certainly lots of different ways for both of those to occur that are getting increasingly likely as time goes on, as I model it. And I think we should get into that. The idea that it continues relatively similar to how it is for 1,000 years, I don't see possible at all. And I can say why I
So he says, that decadence, that ain't going to work.
think this civilization system is actually self-terminating in a much shorter time than that, inexorably. Like, there is no way that it could continue for very long. And so the escape models, I'm fairly dubious of, not because we couldn't, with near-term tech, get some people into space, but we certainly couldn't get something that doesn't depend on Earth, that if we fucked things up here, it's doing well.
And you know, C.S. Lewis deals with some of this Lewis, in the middle of the 20th century, was writing about space travel. And basically his assertion was, you know, if we get into space as we are now, and if we would actually find, you know, life on other planets, we would do to them what we did to the Americas. I mean, this is what we do. It's probably for the safety of, you know, others in the universe, if they're out there, that we're quarantined here in this little solar system. Because no, Schmachtenberger is exactly right. That escape, so we would bring all our problems with us. It's the stereotypical person who left that bad marriage only to make another bad marriage. Because guess what? Half of the problems they took with into marriage number 2. That's how we are. And we know that about ourselves. So, you know, there's not going to be a technical solution
within the time frames that I think will fuck things up on Earth. At least the trajectory as I see it. So then the question you ask, is there some other thing like progress to a totally different type of social system here, or a totally different type of civilization system that can continue for a long time, that isn't self-terminating and that isn't generating catastrophic and existential risks as the byproduct of the architecture of the system itself, is really the only path. So
and I think Schmachtenberger is exactly right. And I think that is, in some ways, the point I'm trying to make. That if you're going to have a new social arrangement, it is predated by a new vision of that social arrangement that is communally seen as good, and that is pretty darn close to what a religion is. It's an ideal out there above ourself, beyond ourself, that motivates us, that we care enough about, that moves us in such a way, but it also moves us in a way that is life-giving in a 360-degree manner. That's what we're talking about. Have we achieved the limits of our imaginary? We're Dostoevsky, and remember, these things move slowly. And so I think bringing, you know, the Russians into this, not Putin, but Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, you know, pleasuring ourselves, we smash the system. We smash the keys. We end the decadence. If otherwise, you know, it's meaning crisis or anarchy, unless you have a vision which goes beyond. And again, I think Douthat's book begins to touch on that, and the W.H. Auden quote that, you know, the Romans, they weren't going anywhere for centuries. And actually, in what was happening in the Roman period was that Christianity was incubating and slowly evolving and taking over the system. And again, this isn't going to satisfy anyone, because the speed of change is far larger than any of our own little lives. Well, then how can change be tracked? Well, change has been tracked, and we've seen this by what we write in books. Basically by the religious tracking systems have been the tracking systems we have used. And again, in many ways, this goes back to, I think, what was at the heart of Jordan Peterson's agenda. There's of course new religions all the time, and so the woke religion has been a new religion, but it's a dead end. And again, this critic of the feminist case for Jordan Peterson that I mentioned, for many young people, Peterson's message is startling. They have been presented with a woke political narrative that views human suffering as the result of an unequal distribution of power. That's certainly true. With those at top of the hierarchy abusing those at the bottom for their own gain. Well, that's certainly true. What they don't understand is that the germ that's inside all the people with power and the people with wealth is inside everybody else, and something needs to die. And again, if you realize that, well, where did that idea come from? Well, you see it in the image of someone on a cross who, by virtue of his assertion, has absolutely everything, Son of Man and Son of God, and comes down and makes himself nothing. Philippians chapter 2. And we all get that. But we can't all do that. Why? And again, someone looking in from the outside would say, this all sounds just like Christianity. The vision. But again, don't get me wrong. I think Douthat's dead on right that the church is decadent, not just the Roman Catholic Church. And, part of what's interesting about the Orthodox Renaissance in the Americas, it's sort of their turn. The Roman Catholics had a Renaissance when it came to America, and I think the Orthodox are having it now. The Protestants got here first, so perhaps we're the most decadent of all, and that's why, well, quite likely the Protestant decadence reached its peak during the Cold War. If only power could be removed from these people, the story goes, then we could arrive at the kingdom of heaven on earth. Yeah, except that new people have power, and so the whole thing starts over again. Peterson says otherwise. He insists that suffering is our lot as human beings, and hierarchies are an inevitable part of that. And so for Peterson, it's the striving up the hill, but you never get to the top. Because it's in the striving that you partake of the sacrament of the feeling of meaning. Douthat's decadence and the meaning crisis come right smack together. They go together. And when Douthat gets to that point in the second part of the book, yeah, you're right there in the meaning crisis, Ross. You should listen to Peterson. You should listen to Vervaeke. They're talking about the same thing. And that's why suddenly Vervaeke and Peterson, all the atheists hear them as religious. You're not going to hear them any other way, because the religious people who know what religion sounds like, McGrath listens to Brett Weinstein and says, sounds like you're advocating for a new religion. Eric's doing the same thing. You need a Douthathian decadence to have the luxury of a gaming PC and a broadband sufficient to pleasure yourself covered with Cheetos dust. We are struggling to imagine a way out. And that comes clear in that's Eric's mission. That's what got Eric churning out stuff. That's why Eric, and when he talks about, I can't sit around anymore. I'm going to go out there and risk it all. Good for him. And when I've heard Eric in other places, go out and try things. Yeah. But how do you have any confidence that anything will matter in any way? The Weinsteins are earnestly seeking a path to maintain a we without necessarily a whole lot of thought into what we is. Well, always complaining about the status quo. And Schmachtenberger, I think, is dead on right. We has to change communally. We have to change individually. We have to change. It's transformation. It's aching for a new religion, but no conscious agents above ourselves. And what's interesting is that, again, the Schmachtenberg, they start, and Rebel Wisdom is knocking on this same door. They're starting to talk about, well, collective consciousness, collective agency, collective intelligence. It's sort of like Jordan. It's sort of a natural theology way of trying to build up the Tower of Babel. Well, we know that individually, well, that's right. So now we're talking principalities and powers, and this is what brings Peugeot into the conversation, because he's just working from the old system, and people, well, that's new. No, it's really old. And so if you actually want to work on this, you're going to have to pay attention to the old and the now. Is it this decadence that we are trying to maintain, even if we realize it's unstable and unsustainable? Now, a note about theology that I made more often in my earlier videos when I was doing more theological stuff and commenting on Jordan's biblical series. We may declare it, eschatology is an interesting thing. We declare revelation as unchanging, infallible revelation, and quite rightly so. And again, if you listen to my same-sex, you don't make progress dismissing the past as such. Chesterton is dead on right here. You have to give your ancestors a seat at the table, because all of us today are bound in the bubble of now, and that has to be done in a rigorous way. And my argument that I've made often in videos about Brett is that this is exactly what theology does. This is exactly what religious communities do. This is exactly the project of religion. And it's why you hold a book up high, and you do that in tension. Now, again, to the silly arguments I hear coming from the likes of Sam Harris, you don't have Christians holding slaves. And what you find in religious communities like Christianity is you have the Orthodox, who are deeply conservative. You have the Roman Catholic, who are very conservative, but both managing change within their institutions. The Protestants proliferating institutional containers in order to try new things. It's all this stuff. And so again, the enormous blind side of the intellectual dark web, which for me seems to be the group that is really earnestly trying to wrestle with this, is their near complete indifference to religious conversation. And again, I understand. The decadence is frightful. Douthat makes that point. But here we are. And what we're basically doing is religion, so you might as well talk to some people who actually have some lived experience in it. Now, I'm not advocating for myself, and people are like, well, you should get on Eric's show. I don't know if that conversation would go well or not, because one of the things that is true about conversations is it takes a long time. And I think one of the things that Peterson did was he, at least via Jung, took religion seriously, and I still think that's part of the reason why his contributions were outstanding. Now, why do I say his contributions were outstanding? Because even though Brett and Eric are making noise and have developed something of a following, Jordan put a whoosh through the culture. That's important. And I don't expect to see any similar whoosh from Brett or Eric. And Brett and Eric are about as smart as you can find. Again, I'll tell you, I listen to these guys, it's like, holy cow, these guys are brilliant. But it isn't just intelligence. It's a whole life. And in some ways, that's what Jordan's been doing. So at least Jordan's openness to religion, I think, is part of the reason he was able to make the whoosh that the others haven't been able to make. Back again about theology. You need a fixed point if the kite is going to fly. You need a fixed ruler if you're going to be able to notice progress. And I think Douthat is helpful, because at least Douthat knows religion. Now, he has sufficient status that, maybe I'll put my 2 cents in. Probably Brett and Ross should talk, because they might be able to have a productive conversation. The thing is, we need analogies. And so, one of the things that I've said about the age to come is, streets of gold, no more tears. You find them in Isaiah, you find them in Revelation, you find them scattered in a few other places. And like I was talking with Brett Sockold, you need analogies. You can't work without analogies, but all our analogies fall short. And so what happens then in decadence is, so if you look at this little image that I grabbed, I did my zeitgeist check via Google Images. You just search an image, you just search a non-material concept and see what images come up. And well, here you are. It's the Emerald City. It's the yellow brick road. It's the city four square. And actually, if you read the Book of Revelation, it looks more like a Borg cube. We need analogies, but our analogies fall short. And in some ways, the pictures we draw mark the limit of our imagination, of our collective imagination. What we have is a crisis of eschatology, and this is an old crisis. And I mentioned before, theologically, you have the pre-mills and the post-mills and the ah-mills. Again, for those of you without any theological understanding, the premillennial, the postmillennial, and the amillennial, based on how they're trying to figure out Revelation chapter 20. Eschatology is one of the theological areas that continues to resist consensus, or at least broad consensus, in the church. There are no church councils on eschatology. Now, I don't know enough, so someone will correct me in the comments and have at it. But it's interesting how dispensationalist rapture ideas have been creeping up in HBO series, and resurrection comes back in Herschel and The Walking Dead commentary on that. Then the post mills were discredited by World War I, and the mills, like myself, really I think that most of the historic segments of the church are some sleepy avoidance about this area. We don't know. And that's why I hope Neil Plantinga can do something with it, because I think we desperately need it. Because this is when I listen to Eric and Daniel Schmachtenberger, if I can ever learn to say that man's name right, they're bumping up against the eschatological ceiling. It's a theological ceiling. It's a ceiling they're not aware of. I don't want to say a glass ceiling, because that's going to lead to a whole bunch of other things. We're trying to do eschatology without God. So often when I was listening to that podcast and listening to some of the real hard problems that Brett and Daniel were bumping into, if you have much understanding of the history of theology, and again, I'm a pastor, I'm not an academic. And to talk to someone like Brett or other academics, they know far more than I do. But you hear it, and it's like, well, when theologians bumped into that problem, God was the answer, and it was often a fudgy answer, but God, in a sense, was the idea that made all the equations balance, and so. Certainly there is a God of the gaps problem inherent in there, but at least the equation's balanced. And so this is where progress has to move forward. And we have limits, like my cat has limits of imagination. We can't imagine anything better, because we simply cut off the fact that there could be someone out there who has in fact known better, and maybe we're not listening. And we don't know what to do with that. And so, in a sense, what you wait is for that one to open the door and say, listen, kitty, this is what a real bed looks like. This is what indoor heating and cooling look like. Here's food. You want to go back out and live under the house? And what the cat does, the cat always wants to get out. Cat won't be out for too long, and the weather gets bad, or the cat gets hungry, and it's not as much fun chasing birds as laying on that big, soft Posturepedic with the nice cotton sheets and the nice down comforter and the heat turning on every now and then. That's exactly what that little decadent kitty wants for a long nap. So, again, religion and culture. Your religious ceiling is your cultural ceiling. And I think Schmachtenberger is seeing correctly that there's no technical solution to us. Give us more power and money, and we'll simply repeat. There needs to be a transformation of us. And that's something that continues to be beyond us, even though we're always participants in it. And again, and I just saw a tweet today with Jordan sitting by a desk working on his book, and I really hope the book isn't a decadent version of the first book. Because at least Peterson, I think, was grappling with these in a more serious way. I think in some ways his book tour got decadent. Too much repetition, too much now. I'd really like to see him get back to a biblical series, because I think it was in the biblical series and some of the videos before the status rocket ride that he was actually making some contributions, and that contribution, I think, was seen in the whoosh. So we need a new whoosh, Jordan. And so we wish you well, and we hope you get better. And don't write a decadent book. And it doesn't have to happen now or in the next few years. You're still a young man. Get healthy, get fresh. Take some time to be alone. You've got enough money to relax a little bit. Do some of the good work that you've done before. And I'd really like to see you do it.